Justin.
Hi, Laurie. How are you?
Good. How are you?
I'm well, thank you. Yeah, I'm doing well.
Good. So, welcome to 42 Canada.
Thank you for having me. Yeah, I'm looking forward to the conversation today.
Yeah, and just for everybody joining us, Justin is an expert in community and social finance. Yes,
Yeah,
I've got
yes,
that
I,
right.
I will. I agree. Yes, I
Okay,
believe that
great.
that is correct. Yes, absolutely. I've been in that space for just about 10 years now, doing social
Okay.
purpose real estate and social enterprise finance.
So, we're going to be talking about community and social finance today, your area of expertise, but we're also going to be looking more broadly at how to build inclusive, healthy communities. So, we'll get into this, and I thought I'd start by just asking you, because we haven't talked for a little while, um,
Ooh.
about the work. If you can tell me more about the work you're doing now, and also how you got into doing that work.
Yeah, for sure. Thank you. Happy to share. So I work as a private consultant. I have a growing community financial firm, Sweeney and Associates. We primarily serve, we serve both sides of the community finance ecosystem. And so by that, I mean, we work with the supply side, or we help folks who have capital. A lot of times this might be like a community investment fund or perhaps a foundation, and they're looking at doing direct investing, or essentially doing investing directly into, let's say, a social purpose real estate project or a housing project. And so for that audience, we provide due diligence support, deal structure, deal advisory. And so we come into settings where these groups want to start engaging locally and want to start putting capital into local projects. But from an administrative standpoint, they just don't yet have the capacity to do so. So we come in and provide some of that fractional capacity, and so that way they can start placing capital, and they can feel very comfortable that the due diligence efforts have been mitigated the risks, and they have a structure they're very happy with, and they know how the deal is going to work and how it's secured, when the money's coming back, and all of those wonderful things. And then on the other side, we also serve the demand side. And by that, I mean organizations who are getting ready to go out and build or buy a community asset. And so that community asset could be housing. It could also be a social enterprise hub. It could be a local greenhouse operation. It could be a mixed use building that includes commercial activity and residential activity. Um, Really, the focus in our area and where we are most strong and of most benefit is as long as it's a capital asset, right? So, looking at some sort of built building and helping groups decide if it's the right move for them and how do they go about financing and funding that to the best of their benefit. And so we help both sides. I guess we got started initially working in community economic development and working on a downtown revitalization project and an industry attraction project in Alberta in the 2010s. And both of those projects, we ended up getting into conversations looking at what could the role of private capital play. So we had public money, we had the money that was available to us, we had the money that was coming from the province, we had some tax revenue, of course, within the municipality that could be allocated to community economic development. But as we were looking at how do we acquire these buildings in our downtown core, or how do we help a group acquire these buildings in our downtown and revitalize them, there was still that need for more private capital to get involved, right, in order to be able to really get the amount of money that we needed. And so that was my first foray into, okay, we can blend, financial sources and resources and interests in a way that makes a really strong community project and has multiple proponents and stakeholders. It just, I realized it opened up so many more doors because instead of trying to get by on just what little grant capital we had, in the world, there was all this other private capital that we could start getting involved into our social projects, right? I mean, social finance. For me, social finance is that we're mobilizing private capital towards some sort of a public good. That's social finance at the very, boiled down as simply as I can make it. And then community finance is really doing social finance, but for a community of purpose or a community of place, and with doing it within that particular kind of place-bound setting. And so I was just totally in love with the whole idea and the concept, and so had the opportunity to join Kaleidoscope Social Impact out of New Brunswick and help them with building their social finance programs for community economic development for housing developers. And I spent 5 years doing that from 2018 to 2023, and then since I've been working as a freelancer, and now this past few months growing my financial firm into that place as well. So it's a bit of how the last 10 or 12 years has galvanized me towards this type of work and this type of expertise.
I was going to ask you that question because I think it's a very, people are very familiar, especially in the community sector or even government sector, the idea of grants, the idea of foundations and donations and fundraising and all these pretty classic tools that come from the charitable sector. And the idea of social finance and community finance, I think, is very new, weird, mysterious thing for most people. There's like a small group, I think, of like you and my, Andy Horsnell, who we both know, and, who have been, and I know when I was president of SEDNET, the Canadian Community Economic Development Network, social finance was a really big priority for SEDNET in terms of trying to move forward a social finance strategy and implementation of it. And I'd be interested to hear your thoughts on where you think it is now, because it's since I moved on from SEDNET, I haven't spent a lot of time in the space, and yet it stayed with me. As you know, as we've been working on some housing stuff, we've been exploring some housing stuff together in the last year, and just trying to think of creative, innovative ways to finance affordable and or supportive housing, so that we can move more quickly when land becomes available, because we know that access to land is still a significant issue. It came up in the housing conference I was listening in and part of online yesterday, that the United Way Maritimes hosted. And we've talked about this before, the idea, most people get pre-approved for a mortgage, and then they go look for a house that fits what they've been pre-approved for, and they're ready to go when things happen. And and there's also, generally in the sector, there's very few people who have, like a commerce or accounting or whatever background. So it's also going to get you to just, if you could just add, what your background is and how you got into this. I mean, you mentioned through community economic development, and certainly for me, being part of SEDNET, that was how I learned about it. And then, would not call me an expert in that space, but the idea of social enterprise, the idea of community and social finance always was intriguing to me, this idea of how could we blend different tools so that we're not constantly going hand out, right? And you're probably familiar with, there was a book a fellow out west wrote. I mentioned it in the video, the conversation I had with Andy. Something about troublemakers, problem solvers.
Oh, problem solver. Yes,
John
would have
Loney's
been
book.
John Loney's book, Army of Problem Solvers.
Yes. So I remember when that was really big and everywhere, and he was talking everywhere. And it was like this big new thing for people, the idea of not just social finance, but this idea of social return on investment and the idea of supportive employment in particular, not just being a good thing to do, but a smart investment by the government or other sources of funding in building the skills of people who have been marginalized in some way. And I think in Sean's case, it was mainly Indigenous people in the area in particular, in Winnipeg. And ensuring that this is not, so the whole concept of social enterprise, community and social finance, I'm wondering if you can sort of speak to that relationship a bit more, and also just quickly a little bit more about your specific background that kind of led to you getting into this work.
Yeah, I'll start with the background because I often, when given the opportunity to speak, and when I've been on speaking tours and I've been with different groups, I make a point of sharing that I did not come in through a finance background or through what might be considered a kind of a traditional finance trajectory, from an education and employment path. So my education initially, I came into this space primarily as an individual looking to create solutions to challenges I was seeing around me. So grew up around a lot of intergenerational poverty and witnessed the impact and the long-term outcomes and the social determinants of health related to insufficient housing, insufficient opportunity, insufficient or inadequate employment, and really just the nature of what happens to us as humans when we're not given an opportunity to, challenge ourselves and cultivate ourselves, and to do so within a space that has some mentorship and some support, right? And so I witnessed this occur over my younger life, and so going into university, I was actually on a trajectory through. I was studying psychology. So I wanted to understand a lot more about motivation. I wanted to also understand if there was more I could do to support some of the folks that are around me from a mental health and addiction standpoint. Mm-hmm. As I was going through, I started with psychology, and then I found I really had an affinity for philosophy, in particular ethics and logic.
Oh my God. I almost did a double major in journalism and philosophy, but I took a logics course and I almost failed it. And if I had failed it, I wouldn't have got my degree. I remember going into the professor's office and being like in tears, begging him to give me at least a C minus somehow, just so I could graduate.
Yeah.
And that was because I was doing really well. And so I had a philosophy professor that encouraged me to, oh, you should do a philosophy degree. And I was all like, oh yeah, okay. And then I did a logic course and I was like, oh no.
There was a lot more to it than I had ever anticipated, right? When I started leaning into philosophy, and I still to this day, the majority of the books on my shelf behind me, the books that I retain, the ones that I typically will read again and again, are the books that I'll retain. And the majority of those are still what would be considered more classic philosophical texts, right? And
I have a whole wall over there that's basically that.
And I find so the math that we do in finance is pretty simple math for the most part. So the numbers and what's being, the math is not exceptionally complicated. And I really loved playing with numbers when I was a kid anyway. So I just always loved playing with numbers in my head. I liked Sudoku problems. I liked logic problems. Was an actual, you're given certain pieces of information and you have to try to figure out the other pieces of the puzzle. And so that was something I really enjoyed from the outset. And I could play with numbers in my head really well. So I was in competitive like math competitions and things like that when I was younger.
Okay, cool.
And just because they call it new math now, the way that they teach kids to do math
more conceptual.
is a little bit different. And
But
so
I'm
I
way more
was
into understanding the concepts behind the math, I think.
and doing a lot more, like instead of carrying the 10, you like start at the front and you kind of add up the thousands and the hundreds, and then you could get, that way you could understand like the big picture. You could do a good guesstimate first, and then you can
Yeah.
understand more specifically afterwards. And I my grade four, I remember my grade four teacher really encouraging me, like, this is really interesting the way that you're doing some of this. And then I remember my grade five teacher just being like, no, that's not how you do that. No, no, you don't do it that way. You do it this other way. And so but long story short, I had the propensity to be able to play with numbers in my head.
Right.
So that was a natural kind of skill that has just been developed and honed over time.
So
And then
did you do a psychology degree or
yeah,
a
yeah.
philosophy?
So I double major in psychology and philosophy,
Oh, okay.
and so yeah, did psychology and philosophy, and then had wrote my LSAT. So I was planning on going to law school. Was
That's
my
funny. I was looking at that
expectation.
too. And then I said, no. A friend of mine was in law school and she talked about how competitive it is. And I was like, oh, that's not me. I am not competitive. I have no competitive bone in my body.
And for me too, I think the nature of why I wanted to go into law school was not in that competitive bent. It really was in that continuing to look for solutions that I could help the
Yeah.
people around me
Yeah.
with, right? And
Yeah.
so, psychology, okay, maybe I can help folks with a little bit on the mental health and the insight,
Right.
and philosophy, maybe I can understand how to live a good life. How do you live a good life? What values and ethics and logic, and how do how does this help guide you? I was not religious when I wasn't brought up within religion, and so I think I found within parts of philosophy that sort of doctrine of, here's some tenets of truth that I could believe in and that I could use to guide me in living a better life and
There's
being a
like
better
a
person.
sense of meaning, purpose,
Mm.
you say?
Yeah, yeah, it
Yeah.
really did. It brought meaning and
Similar.
purpose.
Yeah.
And
Very
so
similar.
I still, like I said, I still read a lot of philosophy today, more so than business texts and other things. I
Oh,
find it's consistently relevant in the work and engaging with other people, so that was my trajectory in my education initially, and then I did my law school admission test, and I ended up getting a position working with New Brunswick Community College in the interim for kind of a summertime, and then there was an opportunity to stay with them for a year, and I said, okay, well, yeah, let's do that. I wasn't necessarily sure where I really wanted to go next,
so
and
were you teaching?
no, I was working with the student association as their student advisor. So I started
Oh,
just by doing more student events orientation work in the first
right.
year. And then I got heavily into, at the time, the six campuses were all provided student capital or funding for student activities based on a per capita basis, right? So large campuses by nature had lots of activity and things that were happening in student life and opportunities, and smaller campuses had none or very little. And so the my effort over the next 4 years was really focused in a couple places. One was actually we got the student associations amalgamated, so there became one student association that could kind of like equitably represent all of the students. And it was that social justice piece was starting to really come to light here, right? That need of social
Mm-hmm.
justice and a driver for myself. So we did that, and we were also successful in bringing in a health and dental plan to help
Oh,
for all of
nice.
the students while we're in as well. So, those were two really big projects that I would center in that space of community development, community
Yeah.
work, because we were serving a community of 4,000 plus students at that point in time. There's many more now. But we're 4,000 plus students, and we were 6,000 students now that I think about it at that time. And so that was a community development work, and so I started, getting involved with the municipality on different things because I would represent the students for intramunicipal bus service. Right, that was a big thing. They were
Right.
trying to get rid of the bus service
Oh,
at this period
interesting.
of time. And so I was working as an advocate and speaking on their behalf relative to the Energy Utilities Board and trying to maintain the intramunicipal bus service. Always representing more the rural and the rural and remote campuses, especially.
Right.
And so that's a big part of where I had grown up, and was in rural and remote. And so I'm at this stage, I'm feeling, I'm engaged in community development. I started volunteering on some municipal committees for the first time. And then I had the opportunity to go out west with my now wife, and we wanted to go see a different part of Canada and do something completely different prior to settling down. And so we moved to Alberta, where she had some family, and I then very quickly we were very entrepreneurial. We started a small natural goods store in this downtown, in this small community. And it's like, you set something up in a small community that hasn't seen something new in a while, and you will get some attention. And so very quickly, there was a request to, would you come out and visit or join the Chamber of Commerce, right? And so, okay, we joined the Chamber of Commerce, and then I think before the end of the first year, I was the president of the Chamber of Commerce, and then was asked to, join the Economic Development Committee.
Yeah.
And then that committee, we had created a strategy and wanted to hire an economic development officer for the first time. So then, somebody tapped me, and I put my name forward, and was lucky enough to be selected there. And so then I moved into economic development, and was working as community economic development officer. I was taking economic development through University of Calgary, as well as the Economic Developers of Alberta, and so the association. And so was kind of building up my chops in community economic development for a couple of years. And the projects that I got to do were the public-private partnership on the industrial land, and working on downtown revitalization. And the need for money and capital was palpable, and for blending, public interests and private interests. And so it was really during that period when I became aware of the notion of finance or community finance. So I loved conceptually, like I could see very quickly, okay, I can understand how this is all going to, this will be huge. If we can activate more capital, we can create more social enterprises, we can create more work generating enterprises for folks, and social purpose real estate and all these things. And so then I started working with Kaleidoscope Social Impact, who was St. John Community Loan Fund. And that was literally, I would say, 5 years of real learning by practicing, right? Just very practitioner learning. I have completed the exempt market proficiency course through IFSC. I've completed the Canadian Securities course through Canadian Securities Institute. I am doing smaller programs on private debt, as well as one on real estate investment. And so I have been continuously working on professional development throughout the entire process, but really allowed the work to tell me where I needed to become more proficient, right? So once I started hitting a roadblock or a wall on something, it was like, okay, no, I've got to get deeper here, right?
I need to learn this so I can apply it.
And get to that next stage. And so it was really applied learning throughout that, as we went from, we developed. So initially when I landed, there was a small pool of about $200,000, and they were doing micro loans. So just loans under $5,000 to individuals who might need it within the community for, entrepreneurship or employment reasons. But yeah, over time, so prior to my leave, and when I left, that 200,000 had become 5 million, and the programs had evolved from doing micro lending to we were doing direct lending into affordable housing projects. And so, my first loans for about the first year to 18 months I was there, I never did anything bigger than $5,000, right? So just a bunch of these smaller individual loans. And what actually gave us this opportunity, and I think that this development opportunity is so vital for building up the intermediary network within social finance and community finance. But I started with St. John Community Loan Fund because of the social enterprise ecosystem project that was under SEDNet in the late 2010s. So I think 2018, maybe 2017, 2018 was
Yeah.
when this project had rolled out. It was the S4ES project
Yes, I
under
remember that
Civil.
acronym, and I remember the talk about the project.
Yep.
I can't remember the exact years when I was president, but I was involved with the board before then and so on. And SEDNET is really where I learned about community economic development, which is
Yeah.
very prevalent in Canada. It's like Canada is very pragmatic, and it's almost like there's more programs in community economic development or more funding and more knowledge in around that, and less actually, I would say, since I've become part of the International Association for Community Development, and now I see around the world, right, of how different countries uh, manifest community development. And community development, the IACD really opened my eyes to thinking differently about community development, but it's also, and not just CED, where Canada, I feel like Canada has always been very focused on community economic development. I mean, even the Antigonish movement was very economic development focused, right? Because it was it was about livelihoods and then funding to improve things in your community and all that kind of stuff. But I also find it fascinating how people come to community development, because it's usually like, there's certainly not in Canada, other places in the world, like the UK, there are particular universities and programs that offer that. And like, I'm at Acadia University doing my PhD now, but it's in educational studies, even though my field of interest is community development. And there is a community development program there, but it has really only started to become really about community development in the last 2 or 3 years. Before that, it was really a recreation management program, and very apolitical, very neutral, very, a very different mindset. And it's only now slightly growing in terms of a social justice focus and a more advocate focused, and climate change and all different things and so on, because depending on who the faculty is that they hired, because John Colton, and I don't know if he's still the head of department there, but he was head of the community development department at Acadia. And he was basically saying, as we hire different faculty who have more expertise as scholars, researchers, as well as practitioners in community development, then the program is shifting, right? And it's becoming more and more what you would think of as community development in other areas of the world, in particular the UK. Like, community development came out of, I think, the Scottish Enlightenment. Scotland's very progressive, lots of co-ops, lots of, like, you go to Scotland and it's just like a different world, and very mutual self-help oriented versus charity, like, please give me some money kind of thing. And it's amazing. And just, I'll put a plug in for the international conference next year in late June. The IACD conference is in Glasgow, Scotland. So if anyone wants to go, I'll put information in the description down below. But so, yeah, amazing, different way of thinking. And they have full university programs, like at the University of Glasgow, that are community development programs. So you go and you study and you get a degree in community development. And in Canada, we really haven't had a lot of that. We mainly have CED programs, I think.
Yep.
Much more. And the idea of community development more broadly, CED just being part of that, is less. So I think it's really interesting how people come to community development. how they become practitioners, whether through CED or because they're interested in social justice or some other, they've been marginalized, or, like I live with a disability. I live with a mental illness called bipolar disorder, and that lived experience very much informs my work around inclusion, building inclusive and healthy communities, right? We've talked about this before. So yeah, I just wanted to say, I find it fascinating, your story of how you came to, and then how you then, as you were doing the work of, trying to achieve more social justice, inclusion, and so on, you identified gaps in your skills that you needed to fill. And so then you've been doing, which from a lifelong learning adult education person perspective, that's also fascinating, because I really think we're moving more and more in the direction of lifelong learning, and formal education is still, there's going to be some value to it, but with AI and all sorts of other things, I think things are going to be shifting significantly. And there's a lot more what's called heuristic learning, which is you identifying something you want to learn, either because it's a practical reason or because an interest in, or a passion about it. And then you just, you go after that learning wherever you can find it and get it. And of course, now we have YouTube, which is partly why I'm doing these conversations, right? Because I think a lot of information on YouTube related to community development, it can be dry or academic in different ways. And so I'm hoping this is a more accessible, interesting, engaging way of doing things. I'm dusting off some of my old journalism skills. But yeah, so and just to get back to you, I'm wondering, where you think, what you think is needed for building healthy, inclusive communities. Like when I use those words, what comes to your mind? And yeah, it's really interesting, the range of financial tools that can be used for that people aren't necessarily aware of. And I think a lot of it is because a lot of people in the sector are very much of that social mindset, that, psychological, social work, whatever. Very few people have a numbers mindset or a business mindset. Yeah, and how that can help build inclusive, healthy communities as well.
Yeah, so a couple things in there, Laurie. First, thank you again for sharing your personal experience, right? Both from background and story, but also your mental health experience as well. Like we've shared, right, both between us, that we've both had experiences within mental health or periods of time that were challenging, and witnessed challenges within family as well. And I think that has been deeply informative as it relates to the empathy and emotional intelligence that I try to bring into the work that we're doing, which within community development and community economic development, really the beneficiaries, and acknowledging and really centering the beneficiaries, right? Both within the ideation, the leadership of the work, I think is vitally important. And so thank you again for sharing that and bringing that forward. Because it also gives me kind of an interlude into the next piece, or the other question, which was, what do I see as being essential, right, within that sort of inclusive environment, inclusive, healthy communities, and the number of different financial tools that can essentially, wrap within there. One thing that I'll say is I firmly believe that the financial acumen and the technical expertise that goes with, let's say, some of the financial modeling or some of the financial planning, that can be ported into a community. And you can still have a very inclusive, very healthy community without necessarily having to have all of those skills and expertises within that community. So I would say that the first is access to this technical knowledge and expertise, right? So if I'm a community and we need to have access to the best practices and new ideas and pilot concepts. And so we need to be able to access the technical capacity, but within the community itself, there really needs to be those people who are champions or advocates or, like an inclusive, healthy community. I would think would be very challenging to create without that community leadership, right? Without folks within the community really demanding or seeing the opportunity for something that's going to be better and taking action towards that, right? Like those, whether it's an entrepreneur, a social entrepreneur, whether it's a social justice advocate, whether it's whoever those folks are that are speaking up and that are identifying challenges and are bringing some solutions to the table. I think that, and having space for these folks where there can be dialogue, right? If we're going to build inclusive, healthy communities, then I think starting at that point of nothing about us without us, that community needs to be at the center of the entire process. So when we center that community and we say, okay, now we have our champions, we have advocates who are coming forward, we have some solutions, we have some ideas. I'll not speak to perhaps, I'm not a planner. I'm not a social health expert. So I can't necessarily say, we would want to have these sorts of educational environments and these sorts of health supports and these sorts of the different things that would come together in a healthy community. So I'll think more just specifically to that financial aspect piece of it. So we have those champions, we have those leaders. They need to have then resources and technical capacity to come in and support, right? The technical capacity and resources, sometimes they can be sourced within the community, sometimes they're outside of that community, but being able to identify those assets and engage them, I think is really that next tier, right? So if we have the first, if it's going to be inclusive, healthy community, it's got to start within the community, they've got to be right at the center of it. And then, afterwards they have to immediately say, okay, what do we have for assets to work with? Like, could be social assets, could be some of the people that are around the project, could be capital assets, right? Maybe we've got a couple unused buildings within the community that could be converted for some of the things that we need, like an enterprise hub or some housing. So, same thing. Maybe I've got a lot of unemployed folks. Well, that also tells me that I've got some people who are looking for labor potentially, or who are looking for employment. So maybe I've got some laborers that are in. So, sometimes you go into a community and they can say, oh, everything's boarded up and there's people who are unemployed and so, okay, well, now we've got capital assets to potentially work with. There's buildings that could potentially host economic activity and different things that are doing. We've got people who are potentially ready to work and ready to be, and again, if you have those people who are advocates and champions, right? And because it all starts and ends with them. If you don't have the advocate and the champion, that's, those folks that are going to help carry these sorts of projects over years and maybe even decades.
Oh, I think something happened to the internet.
Are you back? Can you hear me?
Yeah, you're back. That's fine.
Bound to happen. This is still,
right? Rural internet.
Rural internet, it's going to happen once or twice. I'm not surprised it comes up on occasion, right? So yeah, we have the inclusive, those kind of leaders at the core. We look, what assets do we have? What resources do we have that we can work with within that area? And then what can we port into that community? So that community is then going to need access to that technical expertise and knowledge, whether that's, within the consultants, whether it's in fractional supports, but always with an eye towards building that capacity internally over time. And I think if we can create those conditions for those three things, right? Where, and I'm sure we could add a lot more to it. But I think if we can create conditions where, the leaders and the advocates can come together and they can have dialogue and they can create, identify challenges and solutions within the community. And then, they can have access, or they can see the assets that are available to them, and they aggregate those through partnership. And then, have that technical capacity and perhaps some external resources, whether it's provincial funding or federal funding. Some of these other pieces then need to come in. I think what does not work is looking at that last piece first, right? So saying we need more funding, or we need the province to come
Yeah.
give us money, we need whatever. I think that really does need to be towards the tail end of the process.
You talked about and I want to go a little deeper on the sort of the leadership component of what you were talking about, and then there's the financial. What was the second one you were thinking?
So we have the leadership, we have the so there's the internal assets, right? So we have leaders,
like the
people within the
capacity building,
leaders,
the capacity,
and then there's the assets that are nearby, which could be like buildings, could be other people that are in the community, could be, other programs that are already operating. And then we have the external capacity and funding,
like
right? So what else do we need to bring it? Exactly. And then we bring in.
And I think it's really interesting that you identify things that way, because and I want to dive into the concepts, each one a little bit more, maybe in terms of your thoughts on leadership. And then the capacity building piece, I think, is so crucial. And that came up as a key issue at this conference, housing conference I was listening to, participating in online yesterday, talking about like the rural areas of Atlantic Canada in particular, the Maritimes, being very rural communities, and there being a real challenge with capacity to build community non-market housing, or to build mixed market even housing, and even co-ops. I find a lot of people have no clue about co-ops, which I grew up in a community northwestern British Columbia in Prince Rupert, where the credit union was the fishermen's credit union, and the plants that would process the fishermen's fish were co-ops. And so I just grew up in a community like that. And for anyone who's older in Nova Scotia, of course, they would remember the anti-Ganesh movement, which was very much co-op oriented. But so this concept of leadership and then capacity, and having this sense of mutual self-help, I think it's a very rural thing, though. We just, and what you were describing a lot, of course, is asset-based community development. And it's an approach, I think, that's very specific to community development in many ways. This idea of looking at things, not just looking at problems, because from a problem-oriented approach, it can be very negative. It doesn't, it can drain people. It can feel overwhelming. When you look at things from an asset-based community development approach, it is generative in terms of ideas and solutions. People feel excited about things. They're solving problems, and they're, and not just so much solving problems, but they're aspirational, right? Like they're looking forward towards something they want to create with the assets they have, whether they're human assets or physical assets, buildings and so on, or cash or finances. And like in where I live in Musquodoboit Harbor, I didn't grow up here, obviously, but I married into the area. And my husband's family has been here a long time. So it's very interesting. I would hear or talk with his father about how things came together. And so like the local community center and rink was built by people from the community investing at least $1,000 each to create this rink that has been here now, at least 30 years or something, a long time. They did the same thing with the local hospital. Musquodoboit Harbor is quite unique in having its own little small hospital. And as far as I know the story, it wasn't from the provincial government deciding to put a hospital. It was the local individual people in the community, which was very rural at the time. We're in the rural commuter shed because we're within 1 hour of Halifax now. But years ago, there was no highway, no large highway. It was all just a smaller, windy highway. And the Eastern Shore, even when I started dating my husband, there were a lot of things that were not here in terms of infrastructure, roads and things, that we have now. And really, it was a rural mindset. And there's a book about asset-based community development. I don't know if you're familiar with it. I think it's Clients to Citizens is the name of the book, and I'd have to look up. I'll put it in the description.
In the notes, in the show notes, yeah.
Yeah, but there's a whole chapter on a community called St. Andrews up near Antigonish in Nova Scotia, who very heavily influenced by the Antigonish movement. And it's all about leadership and the idea that anyone can be a leader, but also that leaders are the ones they're the first ones there, they're the last ones to leave, was how one local defined it. But also what was brilliant about the case study of St. Andrews is it showed how diversified the leadership was, how many leaders they had, that leadership, as we might typically think of it, as like a very hierarchical, privileged kind of concept that only a few people are capable of doing. This story of St. Andrews blows that out of the water. It shows how anyone can be a leader. And really, it is about what you were talking about, identifying a goal, something that they want to change in their community, something they want to create in their community, staying with an ABCD sort of approach versus a problem-oriented approach. And then they would build these things. And the same thing with the mindset was the same in Musquodoboit Harbor. When it was time, they felt the hospital needed a helipad, the local community came up with the money for the helipad. When they felt they needed a volunteer firefighting station, or they needed firefighting capacity, everything that they built up. It's only recently that people are starting to shift more to looking to government for solutions. In rural communities, and this is I think common in many communities around the world that are more isolated, and it's not just the idea of co-ops, but cooperation was necessarily, even within the civil rights movement, and the St. Mary's co-op management program is brilliant because they do executive education programs. Again, I'll link below. But they would often bring in people from the US who were involved in the civil rights movement. And one of the largest co-ops in the US is around Black farmers who were in the South, and they needed to work together in order to survive and get beyond, work with the challenges of the time that they were dealing with. So we think co-ops are a very particular thing. There's a particular legal structure and all that. Same thing, social enterprise, and we think about community and social finance, I think, in fairly sort of overwhelming technical terms, but really it all comes down to identifying something you want to change in your community, a goal, and then figuring out how to do it. And anyone can do that. And that is, to me, a leader. But I'm just curious, like, your thoughts on that sort of concept of leadership as part of what you were talking about, the three components before, and also how that relates to the sense of capacity that's needed to create change in communities or to build inclusive, healthy communities.
Yeah, so there's a lot in that, Laurie. There's a
No,
lot
I
of
know.
things.
You know me.
And I love it because there's a few different things that came to mind as you were talking. One is so when I was in Alberta, I was living in southern Alberta, so I was more in the agricultural area. So I was in southwestern Alberta, and so as you talked about Musquodoboit Harbor, I would say that was very much my experience while living in Claresholm, Alberta. And so arriving in this, space and was doing community economic development work. But as I became more familiar with the history and the context within which I was working, and why did something like investment development cooperatives land so well in that environment, right? Why did people opt into this investment development cooperative, which was this form, right, of a investment vehicle that local people could buy into for $1,000 or $5,000 per share, and then the money was used to buy properties in their downtown core and redevelop them, right? And that was what this investment development cooperative was used for. And I, it was so amazing to me, one, that we could even do this, right? That this was a tool; these types of things were possible within the community. But then I just thought, well, geez, why would it work so well in this setting? And cooperatives were very strong already. People were very comfortable and familiar with the idea of cooperatives where at this point in southern Alberta, because of the same sort of community need that you had mentioned with the Black farmers in the United States. As they're building out, I mean, Alberta, in this section of Alberta, is only 127 years old, right? So as they were trying to really develop the farming environment, they needed to work together in order to create water co-ops. It's the only way they were going to ship all that water around for all the irrigation that was going to be needed, was to really work together in order to create that cooperative infrastructure that they could all benefit from. And like you said, it spilled out over into same idea in that community. The community center was built in the 70s. It was built by volunteer community labor alongside, volunteered materials, a certain amount kicked in by the farm store, the Alberta Farm Store. I can't even remember the name off the top of my head. But again, that's what it was, right? They came together and said, this is something we want. And, certain individuals were putting up labor, others were putting up materials. But somewhere within the group was a handful of leaders that probably got together sometime, like you said, some of the first ones there, some of the last ones to leave, who identified the opportunity and were willing to stick with it, right? Like that stick-to-itiveness is really, I think, from a criteria of, community leadership, the stick-to-itiveness is the top. Like if you're willing to do that, because these things just take so long a lot of the time, right? But
Yeah.
that stick-to-itiveness, that galvanizes people over time,
And
right? Like
nothing
over
is ever
time,
easy.
it pulls
Like
people in.
there's going to be anything I've ever tried to do or been involved in or whatever. Just when you think you got it figured out, poof.
Yeah, something's going to come and
Yeah.
switch it all up on you. And so for me, that was another experience. That was a very eye-opening experience because I did not have that same sort of cooperative mentality growing up in southern New Brunswick. Like the co-ops were not as present. They were not as visible. And I just, that I was more familiar with the idea of government's going to give us some money to fix these things. And so, and to me, and it speaks to some of what you were saying, which was, the form follows the function, right? The form, I think, is where the technical expertise can come in and can look at, is this a cooperative? Is it should it have share capital? Should there be share capital in this cooperative? Should there be no share capital in it? Should it not be a cooperative? Should it be a subsidiary holding company of some nonprofit or something like that? But these sorts of okay, how does the form really follows the function, right? And anybody can come in and say, we need more housing, or we need a location that is going to provide this function in the community, or we need, and that is what's vital and what's important is like you said, it's the function that's being identified by those leaders within the community as to this is something that we need to build. And then it really is the form and the resources and other things kind of come after that point. I think we can get tripped up looking at things like, a community bond. I'm on the board with Tapestry Community Capital. I'm a big proponent of the community bond, but I'll also be the first to say that the community bond is not the right choice in every capital asset development project,
Right.
right?
And can you just quickly explain what a community bond is? Because I've also heard that term a lot, and I know it was used in Toronto for this social innovation hub.
Center for Social Innovation, the CSI. Yeah, it was one of the first to use it. Yeah.
But I don't think I've ever fully understood it.
Sure.
And then also how it relates to any other potential tools, financial or type tools, social finance.
Yeah. So a community bond is, and it's a little different. So it's called a bond because of the structure and the terms of this agreement. And what it is a bond is something a community organization can go out and sell, right? So I will sell you a bond. Governments sell bonds. We're familiar with some government bonds on occasion. So a nonprofit organization, they're under securities legislation nationally, a nonprofit or charitable organization can use a exemption within securities legislation to go out and essentially borrow money from their supporters, right? So if you can think of supporters, could be individuals that are a big supporter of an organization, could be the foundations, could be funders, could be all kinds of different folks. So what a bond is it's essentially an agreement. I'm going to sell you this bond right here. And so this bond says that I will pay you X amount in this many years, right? So, you will be able to cash this in 4 years' time, let's say.
Right.
And it's $1,000, but it's going to be 5% interest, simple interest per year. So in 4 years' time, you're going to get $1,200, right? So it's $1,000, 5%, we'll pay you $1,200. Now the terms could be different. I could be maybe paying you out interest or a dividend payment annually, or I could let it accrue and pay it all at the very end. But what's important about a bond is I'm not paying anything on the principal amount until it all goes to get paid at the end. Right. So if this is $1,000 bond and it's going to mature in 4 years, then that means in 4 years you get the $1,000 back plus any other interest. Now that's important in that it's a little different from a loan in that typically with a loan you have to make those principal payments all the way along, right? So you just have to do a lot more repayment. What a bond allows you to do is essentially allows you to go out to your community members and borrow directly from them, and then have a lawyer act as a trustee, and that trustee secures all of the bondholders against whatever the big capital asset project is. So technically they're all secured by a mortgage. We can get into details about, because things get into, you start talking about who would rank first. So, lenders rank ahead of bondholders. And so this comes into how risky is the investment and some of the questions like that. But essentially the community bond gives these organizations an opportunity to go out and, like I said, borrow directly from their community members in a very well-defined process that is secured typically against a capital asset or some sort of a physical built asset in the world. And it gives these organizations a source of that capital that typically is not going to be readily available to them, right?
And so it is an investment of sorts, but it's like a limited, moderate return on that investment. And
It would be called a, so you might have heard
capital, like it's not, you're putting the money in for a period of time, and you're not going to ask for it back until that period of time ends, right?
And those are a couple real key factors, that patience, right? So you have patient supporters. So your capital is coming from patient individuals who are very supportive of your mission, right? So that is, of a lot of value to folks. And you are, what was the other part? Patient. And on the investment side, you're getting what's called, it's a fixed income investment, meaning that it's like if I put it into a GIC. GIC is a fixed income in that the amount that I'm going to make off of it is already predefined. If I give you 1,000 and you give me 5% a year, that's fixed income. I know what I'm getting. It's not going to be different if you do really well or if you do bad. It's going to kind of be the same.
It's not like
way.
Shares where maybe you're investing money and then the idea is, yes, you're going to get at least a certain amount of interest, but also potentially as that asset grows in value, you might get more than what you.
Yeah, your shares would grow in value,
than
right?
Just interest, or like the as the value of the asset potentially grows, then you potentially would get the value of your shares grow in some way.
Yes.
Can you just speak to the strengths, because you mentioned the community bonds can be useful in some situations and not others. So can you just talk to like the pros and cons of community bonds, and also the difference or similarity with like community economic development investment funds, CEDIFs, which, like, Nova Scotia was the first one to come up with CEDIFs, and they've been used really well in Nova Scotia. And then provinces across the country have copied it. But I know New Brunswick, as I understand it, has the newest and most effective new form of what a CEDIF is. So I know it's a very powerful tool, and yet, like in Nova Scotia, it's really struggled because there was one person in the finance department who could help community people with that technical knowledge to create CEDIFs. And so like Just Us Coffee and New Dawn and a bunch of, FarmWorks more recently, all great success stories of CEDIFs and community economic investment development funds, basically. But at the same time, there is this need for that technical knowledge. And if it's not there, which that person left that department, and ever since in Nova Scotia, it's extremely challenging. Literally, the government sending people to Linda Best, who is one of the co-founders of FarmWorks, which is a local food production and distribution CEDIF, that's been very successful here in Nova Scotia. But they're sending people to a volunteer to get the information instead of providing it in-house in government. And I think New Brunswick is different, and maybe other provinces are different. And there's even been talk or threat of getting rid of the CEDIF program in Nova Scotia because people aren't using it enough. But people aren't using it enough because they're not being provided the technical support to make use of it. It's a great tool. So yeah, I know we were talking about community bonds, and certainly, what are the pros and cons of community bonds, but also if you could speak to the concept of CEDIFs and like what you think are what's working well in New Brunswick, especially since there were some revisions, and what you think is missing maybe elsewhere.
Yeah, great questions. So let's start with some of the pros and cons, perhaps, with either a community bond or a seat of style raise. So in both scenarios, you are doing a public campaign. So you are looking to raise capital from a multitude of investors. And so one of the, let's say, conditions for success, right? The preconditions for success is having that sort of existing network to be able to tap into. So what I might say there is that one of the cons to doing a community bond or a CEDAF when you're looking at those is if you are an upstart or a startup organization with very little social capital yet to be developed, meaning you don't have much of a network, there's not a lot of people that maybe follow or know about the program or initiative yet, it can be challenging to then immediately go out and try to utilize one of these community-oriented tools, which really are successful more often than not because they're built on a foundation of existing trust, right, and existing relationships. And so this is that would be, you know, one of the things that I would say might be if I'm evaluating if I'm doing one or the other or which one's going to be the right fit for me. I would immediately say, okay, well, who could I potentially put into that investor seat to go out and have conversations with? And if I have followers, right, like, then maybe that's a very good possibility. I would also look at these are typically going to be best if you're looking at projects that are, you know, greater than, I would say for a community bond, you really want it to be more than $1 million or more in the value that you're going to be raising from your investors. The reason that I would set it at around that dollar figure is to ensure that the money that's coming in is going to accommodate the administrative costs of operating these campaigns. So what do I mean by that? I mean, I can go in and for me, I could develop a data room and a package to go in and talk to a credit union and go get financing. And I could put that together in a relatively short amount of time. And I could do it almost entirely by myself. But it's a completely different thing if I'm going to run a community bond campaign and I want to raise, you know, a few $1 million and I'm, you know, going to, you know, we've got to identify the project. We've got to get essentially put together an offering document, which has, you know, all of the details about, you know, the bonds, the projects, the organization, the business plan, the financial models, the financial history, all of those things an investor could ever possibly want to see. And then there are, you know, there are administrative requirements, right, from a taxation perspective as well, and how things are reported, which is why I often recommend it. You know, I sit on the board with Tapestry Community Capital. They are the foremost consulting agency in Canada as it relates to the community bond movement and leveraging community bonds. They've successfully run campaigns in every province of the country and have been successful in helping to support more than $130 million through community bond campaigns to date. That's where I'm talking about that technical expertise and porting that in. That technical expertise can come in and really support on, you know, running through the community bond. Now, when do we want to consider a CEDAF as an alternative to a community bond? So the CEDAF, and what I would likely do again is I would look at my investor groups and I would say, you know, who am I going to engage around the table? Because because a CEDAF is going to be attractive to certain investor groups.
Right.
So if I'm doing a CEDAF, but a lot of my groups that I'm going to reach out to are national foundations, they're maybe not going to benefit, as they will not benefit if they're not, you know, a Nova Scotia corporation or individual, right? So there's kind of a geo-bound physical, like in order to
and I should
benefit
probably
from the
mention, I mean, my understanding of the C. diff in Nova Scotia and its origin story and how the idea of a C. diff evolved was partly the government wanted to encourage Nova Scotians to invest more of their RRSPs, retirement saving plan, in local businesses and local communities and that sort of thing. And so they offered a tax credit, or I think
It's a tax
related
credit.
to RRSPs, like to encourage that. And then and similar to a bond, you would put it in, the idea was that it was patient capital. It would go in for a few years. You would even get maybe a bonus if you left it in longer, or a higher return. But when you wanted to take it out, you could take it out, but you were committing to leaving the money in for a certain period of time. So that tax credit component, RRSP component of the program, is one of the reasons why it can make it quite complicated to use. And I've actually been reflecting recently that, like, Ryan Gibson, who we both know, who's a professor to do with regional economic development at the University of Western Ontario, Guelph, University of Guelph. And Ryan and some students did some recent research that showed, though, for people who are investing in C. diffs, the tax credit actually isn't that important. And yet that's, to me, it seems the most complicated piece. I don't know about other provinces, how it works, whereas if you were to just do a co-op structure, which a lot of people don't realize, co-ops can be nonprofit or for-profit. They can be producer co-ops, they can be worker co-ops, housing co-ops. There's all sorts of different ways to use the co-op structure. And you could, I think in Nova Scotia, you can have two types of shares. You can have like a regular share, and then you can have a share that's like an investment share, and you may or may not even have a vote in the organization, but you have a vote in the sense you're putting money in, and you can take that money out anytime. But what you don't have is the complication of the RRSP and the technical requirements at the same level, as I understand it, as if you were doing a C. diff, compared to doing a co-op that is a for-profit co-op in some way, but an equity-based co-op that is looking to do something like, there are equity-based housing co-ops, and they are also, I think, usually predicated on the idea of a moderate return, right? And patient capital as well, sort of idea. And yet within the housing sector, there's a lot of people who, at least in Canada, and in particular Atlantic Canada maybe, or more Eastern, I think they're more common out West in British Columbia, the idea of getting a return somehow is like bad. And I think that speaks to a broader issue within the idea of community and social finance and so on, is this idea that if I take money that I could invest anywhere and I put it into community or social finance, whether it's a C. diff or bonds or whatever, somehow it's bad for me to expect a moderate return on that I'm being the bad capitalist if I do that. And yet I think we really need, just to go back to what we talked about too at the beginning of our conversation, we need a mix of financial tools, whether it's grants, donations, as well as equity investment, in order to accomplish a lot of the things that we want to do. I think we need to be thinking more creatively and innovatively when we look at the resources we need to try to accomplish something in community. And thoughts on that?
So I agree. I have adopted within my financial modeling and within my ethos as to how we operate within my firm. Uh, we look primarily at minimal concessionality within the work that we do, and what I mean by that is we have recognized that the capital needs to either meet the sustainable development goals. Let's say if that's the kind of the metric that we want to hold to. The capital needs to meet the SDGs are so greatly outstrip 100% of the donation and grant and capital and that exists that we just can't reach these sorts of lofty aspirational goals as a society or just as the race of humans. Like for us to reach these kinds of SDGs for everybody, the capital requirements are through the roof, right? It's trillions upon trillions upon trillions upon trillions. And we can't grant and donation our way into that kind of capital. And so, we look at it and wherever possible, how can we leverage that kind of so if I can get, if I could go out and I could run maybe a capital campaign and I can try to raise, $1 million and try to get it all in donation and grant and non-repayable capital and get my project built accordingly. But if that project could sustain $750,000 mortgage that it could pay over time based on the operations of that project, does it make sense? And am I being ethical in taking more of the the concessional capital than what I really need? I
Oh,
mean,
that's interesting. I have never heard it put quite that way. And I wasn't sure exactly what you meant by concessional capital, to be honest. So if you want to
the
expand on that a little bit, just to
yeah,
in
concessional
a little
or
more layperson
non-repayable,
language. But
right?
the concept of if we use more of this, we're freeing up more of this
Yes.
for other things that maybe can't access this.
Yeah.
That I find fascinating.
Well, and because for me, and I think in a lot of the spaces, I mean, it does not work in every setting, right? There will be settings where you're going to need 80, 90, 100% concessional capital, non-repayable capital, grant donation capital, where you don't have a liability that comes along with it, is what I mean by the concessional and the non-repayable. Um,
Do you
you
mean asset versus liability?
No, so if it
Oh,
comes in as so let's say if I get capital as a loan, it comes in
right.
as cash. It's cash on my books, but it's also a
Oh, but it's
liability.
also a liability because you have to pay it back. I gotcha.
Exactly. Where if
Okay.
it comes in as a non-repayable contribution, great, I've got it on the cash
Right.
side, but I've got nothing on the liability side, right? So that's still
But usually also, I think you mentioned this at the beginning, that usually when you're using these financial tools, you also need to, you're developing some kind of asset, whether it's a social enterprise, the labor force, or within that social enterprise to do something, or a building, or yeah.
yes, and so concessional using a minimal amount of concessional capital has been is important. I believe in reaching the SDGs and reaching these sorts of lofty goals because we want to activate as much private capital as possible. That's what social finance is, right? Social finance is that private capital for a public good, right? Which means we've got to either pull it in, and it can be from a tier one bank, it could be from a credit union, it can be anywhere where it is privately held capital that we can pull into these projects to then offset how much grant and donation money we really need to get. That to me has been, for one, it's been one of the best ways to achieve success from an expedience perspective, like how quickly can we reach success, but also how successful are the projects based on just the number of stakeholders that are looking at it. If all you do is get one type of funding, so if it's all grants and it's all donations and that's all you're getting, and you never have a lender take a look and kind of have that, debt coverage analysis and have and really look at your operations from that perspective, again, you're only getting so much insight on your operating model. So with these larger capital asset projects, when you can blend and have, the municipality has a presence, the non-repayable funders like foundations are putting some capital in, perhaps there's some private ownership or private capital, all these different lenses of, risks and motivations wrapped around one project just helps create a really nice blend of perspectives that I have found creates more successful project outcomes in the long run, as opposed to, no, we don't want private capital, or we don't want those investor mentality around the table, or we don't want business acumen and that kind of traditional capitalist mentality. Well, that mentality and that an analytical skill can be really helpful in building strength into the financials of a project. And so it's kind of like, having the devil's advocate, or, just going out and you want to understand more about your position, find the most believable person that disagrees with you wholeheartedly, right? And have a good conversation with them and try to understand more. And so, around these projects and these opportunities, I think that same blended approach is viable. I think it also helps us with mitigating some of the divisiveness and silos that can happen within community. But yeah, I'll give that back to you, Laurie, and see. Hopefully, I answered your question well on that one. If I created any new ones.
No, and just we'll wrap up here shortly, and people can let us know in the comments if they think, they'd really love to hear more about community and social finance and different tools and options, because I think it is an area where we need to increase awareness within the community sector, community development. And really, I mean, people are always looking for money, but I don't know any community organization or initiative that isn't looking for money in some way. But to have an awareness, this to me is a part of, it's funny. On one hand, it seems very innovative, very new, and it is. On the other hand, it's a very old practice. We've been doing this for a long time. As soon as you talk about cooperation, whether you're talking hunter-gatherers or people who settled in villages to do agriculture, there was this concept of cooperation and sharing of resources out of just a basic need to survive. And then we sort of got into this very neoliberal capitalist, I'll say, especially in the 80s, I think things went kind of very extreme one way. I think things are swinging back a bit. And also this idea that it doesn't need to be extremes, that there can be a blending of these different ideas, these very old ideas and also new ideas, but also this idea of capitalism or and socialism, right? Really. I mean, and the idea that you can be an investor and not be gouging people,
Yes,
like
that was the other thing too.
There's all this talk, especially within the housing sector, of these big corporate entities that are, have consumed all sorts of housing and taking up. And in response, there's been the development of community land trusts. And, I think it's Parkland in Toronto that led the way in creating the idea of buying land and taking it out of the system so that community holds the land. And then different groups, can build housing or own housing that's separate from the land, which reduces the cost. And there's a lot of situations. There was an eco village in New York that I visited in Ithaca, New York, where they did fundraise, like donations and all that kind of stuff, to buy their land so they could put their land in a community land trust. But then their housing is equity-based housing, co-op housing, where they own shares relative approximately to the square footage of their home. And then recently they identified, well, we don't have as much diversity in our community as we would like. So in our next development, we're going to build some rental housing as part of, so you have equity-based housing plus rental housing. And there was some talk of that yesterday. But yeah, just to get back to the bigger picture of these seem very innovative, very new ideas, but in some ways they're not, especially within rural communities or any situation where people are facing adversity and need to come together just to survive and to thrive as well. And yeah, it's something that I think people in community, we need to look at revenue diversification. We need to look at more innovative ways of doing things. And I think including private equity or investment through different tools, whether it's community bonds, CDIFs, and so on, it's something we need to look at. And in the housing sector, a mixed financial model of some market-based housing, some as well as non-market-based housing, is actually considered the most sustainable form of development, I think. So yeah, just before we wrap up, any final thoughts on any of that? And yeah, if anyone wants more to learn more about this stuff, because I think it's been really eye-opening. There were a lot of terms that I have been familiar with over the years, and the investment readiness program federally is another whole thing that we could be talking about, but which is about building capacity for people to do social finance. But I don't think there's a lot out there for ordinary community people to be able to understand, oh, there's more than one way of finding the resources we need to do whatever it is we want to do.
There's a great program. So 3 points that I'll make as we wrap
Sure.
up, Laurie. One is there's a great program out of British Columbia offered by friends of mine through Scale Collaborative called Thriving Nonprofits. And so this has been delivered. There's well over 1,000 plus organizations across Canada who have taken this program. It's 7+ years in the making. And so in that program, they've identified a minimum of 9 sources of potential revenue, including, your partnerships, your leverage, your assets, your grants, your unearned revenue, or your earned revenue, up to 9 potential different streams, essentially, in order to bring resources into an organization. And I do think, yes, absolutely, we need to be aware of as many as possible in order to maintain viability within our organization and recognize which ones fit which place. Right. What do you use if you're looking for operating funding or core funding? What are you using if you're doing a special project or an community asset build, right? They're different at different times. So great program that I would recommend for anybody, and another, just a reinforcing of that agreement that diversification of revenue is key. Non-market and market housing, I also agree. There's this push, we got to get from 4 to 20. Yeah. Is the idea. And you might have heard this before, that we're essentially at about 4% of our purpose-built housing stock is currently non-market or held by charities, nonprofits, nonprofit cooperatives. And to get to that level of stability where we believe that, yes, okay, we're going to have some affordability and it will be without significant intervention or regulation, it would be relative stable affordability on its own. The number is closer to 20%. Right? So
yeah, and that's the number comes from a lot of European countries have a much higher percentage of community or non-market housing.
Yeah, and so I agree wholeheartedly. Is a big part of everything that I do. At the end of the day, I want to see a significant amount of non-market ownership, not 100%. There is, again, it will go all one way or all the other way. But when I also look at the population, and if I think about, and if you look, when you read about, what percentage of that population or our population is vulnerable at any given time, you think about 20 to 30% of our population as being vulnerable, which across mental health, like if you're looking at mental health challenges, you're looking at addiction issues, you're looking at whether it's exclusion based on, gender or sex or, sexuality or any of these different things. you're looking at a pretty significant, 20, 30, 40% of the population really at any given time. And so it makes a lot of sense to me that we're in and around that 20 to 25% figure of
Oh, that's a
really
very
just
interesting
folks
way of
not
thinking about it. I haven't thought
looking
about it
at,
that way.
yeah,
Yeah.
when looking at, percentage of vulnerable
Yep.
population, what percentage of our population could likely be vulnerable at any given point in time? And let's recognize that non-market housing helps to stabilize in these vulnerable positions, right?
Right.
And we all, I mean, you hear about the housing first model for everything, right? Like if it's someone, if it's addictions, if it's mental health, and well, if you don't have stable housing, you're not going to get to the job interview and resume building work
Exactly.
if you've not tackled the stable housing work on the front end, right? And so, that 20% of non-market as being, and it's a way that we can build in this sort of social safety net without it having to be a government operated social safety net. Like it
Right.
is essentially just building community wealth versus private wealth,
Yeah.
putting the wealth of these assets into the hands of community-based organizations and community leadership relative as opposed to individual or
Right.
corporate leadership. Right. And so, I mean, for me, I think that 4 to 20 movement is something, and that number, right, that just it really captures things for me when I think about how much work there still is to do in, capacity building and like financially moving these assets over. And the third I'll mention is, and you spoke to it a little bit, which is this idea of return and what is an acceptable return and what should people be looking for a return on these products. And so it is, it's important for investors to be out there and to be savvy, and for investors to, the individual investor in environments that I'm familiar with and where I have been, there's been ample communication to these individual investors around, what is happening, the risks, however, it's important that investors recognize, if you're pulling money out of an RRSP that is intended for your long-term retirement. I mean, this is an important bit of capital for you, right? If you're,
Yeah.
we don't want to lose that principal. You don't want to overinvest that principal, right? So you don't want to say, oh, okay, well, I'll put, I don't like capitalism anymore. I'm going to put through cash out my whole RRSP and put it all into this project because I really believe in it and think it's great and can get 8%. So it is, the advice for the investors as well, like while thinking about this, is by all means, a moderate return is very acceptable, right? Like you should be gaining a moderate return on your capital. It's the access to capital that is really the impact and the benefit in and of itself. So if it's a 4% capital or 7% capital, the end of the day, it might not matter that much if it's the difference between getting capital and not getting capital, right? So, the return, I mean, I think it is totally acceptable, and investors in these positions should be getting a moderate return for, the capital that they're putting forward. And not only that, we need to, constantly recognize that most of these investors are average net worth individuals, not high net worth individuals. Yeah. And so we want to make sure that we're always bringing the best projects forward, where we're making sure we're communicating everything as well as possible so the investors are as informed as they can be. Because what you get, for instance, if I go to get a CEDAF and I go through the government, and they will give me what's called a letter of non-objection, which then allows me to go out and raise my money, right, and go into the public.
Right.
But what's important to recognize is the letter of non-objection is not saying that this is a good business model or that this operation is
that it's
going to make
risk-free
money
or anything like
or
that.
that it's risk-free or any of these other things. And so it is like, it really, the investors should take the time, ask a few questions. These are very legitimate opportunities. They can be very well secured. I know on the community bond side, Tapestry has yet to lose $1 of bondholder capital. But that being said, there is still risk associated with all of this, right? And so it is very important that people put in an amount that they're willing to risk, right? I always like that idea of like, if you're talking about RRSPs, like a 5%,
yeah,
right? Like 5% or less of your RRSP to go into something like housing that would be local, meaningful, that you would be attached to. I mean, that to me, from a portfolio management perspective, I think is a very respectable amount to consider initially. And I think our success as an ecosystem will continue to improve and grow as we as we do more of these projects, and as typical wealth advisors start to go, oh, okay, some of these alternatives in the space of social purpose real estate, there's some viability here, and I think that's what we're doing. It's like you said, a lot of what we're doing is not necessarily new, but I think the fact that we're trying to formalize it and make it more mainstream, I think is really what's more modern over the last 15 years, where I think prior it had been happening, but happening almost by default. Like, you have to do these kinds of things in order to get some of these community projects going, but without really identifying the practices or the body of knowledge maybe that's needed in order to do it well. And I think that's what's come about in the last 15 years. How do we build up new practitioners? How do we formalize or create like accreditation processes that help intermediaries go raise more capital? Some of these things exist in the US already, and we can borrow from our neighbors on how they have done some of these things very well. But those are some of the pieces that I see happening in the future that will really continue to accelerate the rate of this activity. Things like national accreditation, things like there is a push for a national guarantee pool right now, which would these different intermediaries would essentially be able to apply, and then they would have like this guarantee that would back them. So again, it just helps with raising more capital. How do we, guarantees are like tax credits, are like, these incentives. What's going to incentivize people to get involved? And so, those were a few finishing points, I suppose, Laurie, kind of that 4 to 20, always looking for, yes, moderate return, and being very, being very diligent as you're looking at these investment opportunities and recommending that. But then, and then also looking at your investor groups as being a primary determinant on how you're looking at community bonds or CDIPs or something. So, and if you're confused or if you're unsure, then that's when it's a great time to reach out to me.
There you go. And we'll make sure your website and so on are below as well.
Yeah. Hopefully include the email would be great.
Yeah, I think and just to wrap things up, I think what's interesting about this conversation and like the work you're doing in particular, and it's another tool, it's another option, it's another potential resource, and so ensuring people are just thinking more broadly, that as part of innovation within the sector, within the community development sector, community sector, and people go through grants. I mean, that can take a lot of time and energy, trying to get money out of government, trying to fundraise, that takes time and energy. This is just another option, another tool that as we've been discussing, on one hand, has been a very old tool, part of the civil rights movement, part of co-ops, part of rural communities for a long time, have always worked this way. It's a pooling of resources. And then, either you get back what you put in, basically, or you could get back what you put in, and then with a moderate rate of return. And that, there's nothing wrong with that. That's okay. And we need to shift and not be quite so paranoid about capitalism, that you can be an investor and expect a moderate rate of return. And as you said, many with the CDIPs, many people are investing more so for the passion, for the cause, right? Than even the RSP thing, is what Ryan's research showed. But so understanding that it's sort of new, but it's sort of not new. And so it's not a bad thing. Community wealth generation and even looking at ways to address intergenerational poverty, for instance, as you introduced me to the concept of fractional ownership within housing. So ensuring people have more of a, especially people who do not have a lot of wealth to work with, especially intergenerationally, to be able to move beyond that situation, we need to give people different options for building equity, and for our communities to build community wealth that can be shared and so on in different ways as well. And this is another tool, and it's something I think many people in the sector just need to be more aware of, and then also where they can go if they want to pursue this and want to get some of that technical expertise to help them do it. Just like you would get technical expertise to do any other kind of revenue resource development project, whether it's fundraising or grants or whatever, and so on, right? And it could be a volunteer. It could be someone who used to be in business and, has a business mindset, but, are interested in applying those skills to a social justice kind of context or something. So there's many different ways to access.
I will actually say that those are some of the best folks that you can put on your board. Apologies for interrupting there, Laurie.
Yeah,
but
no,
I
go
do
ahead.
believe that those are some of the best folks. Like when you walk in, or when I walk into a setting and I'm working with a board or a committee, and that board or committee is, if we think about it from a skills perspective or skills matrix, is almost exclusively strong within the social justice or the client facing activity, it can be challenging to then introduce what is very foreign sort of business acumen, financial acumen. But if we go into a setting where they've already have business acumen and legal acumen and different things, but these folks are also galvanized around the social meaning of things, then you've really got some strength, because now they understand the social side, but they've also got the business acumen. They can speak, if it's about lending terms or things like that. And they're typically more, or you could either put it either way, less debt adverse, or they're more comfortable with potentially taking on debt. And that is something that the boards need to get their head around and feel comfortable with if they're getting into that social finance, community finance space, is the idea that we may have some debt that's tied to this project or asset. But again, it should be debt tied to an asset or project, right? If you're looking at it for operating costs or things like that, there might be there's a very different conversation to be had there.
Yeah.
But that's again where somebody like myself can come in and provide that advice, right? So it's
and I just love that last point about there many community organizations, many boards are very worried about their fiduciary responsibilities and are very risk averse. But an easy way to get started with this is to bring someone in as a guest, even if they don't know the specifics of community and social finance, if they're not an expert like you, but just bring someone in with a different background. Maybe they're a chartered professional accountant or whatever, and just ask them to help you brainstorm different ideas to be able to think outside the box. Thank you very much, Justin. I really appreciate it. Sorry we kept you extra long, but I think this has been an amazing conversation, really valuable. And just thank you very much.
No, I appreciate it. I knew as soon as we got on the call, we were going to be able to run at length if we wanted to, right? And so
it's a big
and I still feel like there's a great deal of things that we could have gone deeper in, but hopefully we'll be able to schedule another one of these and explore a little bit further.
That's great. Thanks very much.
All right, thank you. Take care, Laurie.
Take care.